Well, thank you all for joining us tonight to hear about Native nations and just to learn from Kathleen. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. It's been really joyful to learn. I feel like I've learned about you as I've been reading this book, and then your approach to your research and the work that you do. I really do appreciate it. So we have some questions that we've talked about, and then we'll open it up to Q&A afterwards. And we'll just get started. How is that? Okay.
Thank you so much, Danielle.
Thank you. So tell us what inspired you to write this book. You know, what interventions do you see these collective stories making? And, you know, I can imagine Random House has different goals and objectives than traditional university presses. So, you know, what inspired you?
Yeah, so I think it has to do with, I think a lot of non-Native Americans these days see Native Americans everywhere, right? In the movies and on TV and big Supreme Court cases and art museums. There are a couple of huge art shows going on right now with Native art. And I think a lot of non-Native Americans have trouble sort of squaring that with Native American history the way they learned it. The way it's usually taught is, I think people get an impression of Native Americans as something in the past, and sort of a history of pretty quick sort of decline and loss, sadness, and then maybe kind of disappearance. And I think a lot of Americans absolutely know Native Americans didn't disappear. There's no way to kind of think that if you're paying any attention in the United States these days. But what I wanted to do was try to sort of bridge that to help readers, and as you say, readers of a Random House book, understand that long history, how it did happen. The Native Americans are still here today, and that they're still here as nations, right? They're still here as communities, that they aren't not just as descendants. And so I'm an early American historian, and there is a wealth of scholarship these days on Native American history in sort of all eras. And I think this is a book that wouldn't have been possible to be written 20 years ago. It's just all these historians have been doing amazing work. Most of which is with academic presses and is widely read within historical circles. But I wanted to sort of get this out a little bit further than that and talk about really, so I think what I most want readers to get is the long history, this long and continuing history to the present and into the future. That so I start 1,000 years ago, as you know, and with long before Europeans were here. That history was happening on the continent, and then through many centuries of what I think too many people think of as very quick colonization. Mm-hmm. In fact, Native Americans were the majority of the population of North America, and controlled the majority of the landmass of North America for centuries after 1492. One of the first chapter in the book that is post the arrival of Europeans is here in North Carolina, and a place that at least some people called Osamokamuk. It's sort of a word that was used for coastal North Carolina, but I kind of use it a little bit more promiscuously to mean kind of the place where most of North Carolina's Native nations today were from, right? That it was, at least that's an indigenous name I can kind of put to the very English name of North Carolina. And that, at least in North Carolina, when people study Roanoke is kind of the big story. The English people came, the way the Lost Colony play, at least used to tell it until a couple of years ago, was that Roanoke starts American history. And then they have to kind of admit toward the end that the colony totally fails. And it really doesn't start American history at all. If it had American history, European colonization would have been very short. So that chapter really flips it and shows these are the Native peoples who were here in the 1500s and whose descendant communities are still here. And for a long time, they were in charge. And then the book takes it on through the centuries and shows how Native peoples have had to adapt to the rising power of colonists of the United States. but have adapted and sort of against the odds have managed to remain as nations, as Indian communities with some sovereignty still lasting and will last into the future.
You know, this is one of the insights to the work that you do that I noticed, and I'm going off script a little bit, y'all, so bear with us. I've noticed that in each of the stories, and I appreciated in each of the stories, you offered a contemporary person who either connects to that historical tribe or that land to provide that voice within just the contemporary context, but also to show that that tradition has survived in some way. It might not look the same as 100 years ago, but those stories continue. And I wondered if you is that a sly Kathleen DuVal sneaky way of showing that natives are still present and a part of today everyday life?
Absolutely, yeah, okay. Yeah. It sort of has many inspirations, all of which sort of spring from learning from colleagues at UNC and beyond for the last 25 years. You know, when I started writing early American history, and it turned out that Native American history was a huge part of that. I always knew it would be part of it, but it turned out to be a much larger part of it than I thought. And it takes time to learn things, yes. Right? And for several decades now, I've been learning from Native scholars, both within tribes and in colleges and universities, about things that they know about their own people. It's not should be surprising, right? Yeah. It should be pretty obvious, but it has really taken academic historians a long time to figure out how to fold that into the way we write and teach history. But I think Native American and Indigenous studies methodologies have really. That's me. Wow, that's wonderful. Just trying to make everybody feel better. Native American and Indigenous studies methodologies have sort of said both the importance of thinking about how scholarship affects tribes today, but also taking very seriously tribal knowledge and the knowledge of tribal scholars and tribal linguists, and so it's just. So as an ethnohistorian, I was trained to use every possible type of source, archaeology, documents, and so tribal knowledge today is part of that. And I think it's it turns out to be surprisingly easy to figure out how to use that in talking about the distant past. And people have been really generous with me in sharing what they know. And so in every chapter I want to remind the reader this is there are connections today. These people are still here today. So thank you for noticing that. I do. It's really important to me. And
No, as a Native scholar, I appreciated it. I appreciated grounding and that history is here today too. Yeah. So not always in the past. Yeah. So there are several themes throughout the book. One of the ones that I noticed and that emerges pretty often is the importance of relationships. And that starts really at the beginning with Nokia. And whether these relationships are intertribal, intra-tribal, or with foreign actors, this prevailing theme emerges in each of the stories that you tell throughout the chapters, and very much flips the scripts on the mainstream. So this is what you were saying before with the narrative of the U.S. and the participation of Indigenous peoples. And this flipping of the script really demonstrates that Indigenous peoples are active participants of what's going on throughout history, and then strategically forming these relationships to achieve their own goals. And can you discuss just the importance of these relationships as you saw them, as you were writing them, and the value of offering a different narrative of how Indigenous peoples relate with one another?
Yeah, Danielle is a political scientist, so she's particularly attuned to and knows much more than I do about that kind of thing. But so I think from my first book, I've been really interested in how Native nations dealt with each other, how Native communities dealt with each other, in this, I start in about the year 1000 or so, and with some of the big cities, urban spaces, large scale civilizations, agriculture that existed in North America in that period, sort of parallel to the medieval period in Western Europe. And those, partly because of climate change, partly because I'm sure of many internal reasons, those cities fell around the 1200s in various times. But and what came afterwards was a general different way of getting along with other peoples and within societies, and probably with other nations and with other peoples whom they were at peace with, reciprocal trading relationships, and a real emphasis on repeat myself a little bit, on reciprocity in diplomacy and trade, and that sort of a view of that kind of relationship as kind of like putting something in the bank, like which is completely anachronistic, but saying that if you in a trading relationship provide more than your trading partner, that's actually a good thing. That's a value that sort of somewhat different from what we sort of think about in a capitalistic trading system, because you're saving for the future. That's actually a way of saving, and that means that if, say, your crops fail in some year, you've built up this this credit sort of that you can sort of count on to be paid back to you. And so across North America, there's this real emphasis on that kind of relationships, and then the sort of importance of sort of sustainability and stability in those long-term relationships. And I think those last into the colonial period, and they're one of the ways that Native nations have survived in sort of, and I in no way mean to suggest there weren't wars and enemies. There are plenty of those things, but in other nations, other peoples with whom one's own people have a good relationship, that it could provide a way of surviving sort of some of the worst parts of colonialism. So, for example, some of the wars that happen against the English on the East Coast, the refugees who flee from the East and take refuge with, say, the Creek-Muskogee Confederacy in what's now Alabama mostly. And they're able to be incorporated through some of these sort of pre-existing, I think, sort of political philosophies of reciprocity, of sort of figuring out how that kind of incorporating a new people can be useful to everybody. I think something similar happens when the Catawbas form, as some of the peoples from around here end up becoming Catawbas. And I think in some ways we can only imagine the intricate sort of work that took to do, but we can see the results of it, and certainly know in sort of oral histories of talking about how different peoples came together, and even sometimes descendants today can say, I was from this, and it's amazing how long ago they still know that's their people that came in and became Catawba or Creek. And then in North Carolina's Native peoples, there clearly is there's a building together of a group of people who may have thought of themselves as different peoples in earlier centuries for survival. And so one of the things I sort of trace in the book, I think, is this combination of using relationships and sometimes incorporation and combining to survive, but also this sort of other force moving, which leaves us today with something like more than 600 federally and state recognized tribes in the United States alone, not counting Mexico and Canada. So there's also a sort of parallel push to remain different, right? There's clearly Native Americans did not want to all just become Native Americans and no longer have their particular identities as peoples. Yeah. I don't want to say anything else about that.
That makes me think, so I guess this is serendipitously, as Kathleen mentioned, I do a lot of work within political science, public policy. Before I joined the American Indian Center, I worked with the Native Nations Institute, where we did on-the-ground training with tribal communities around strengthening their governance system. And just last weekend, I went to Quapaw.
Fantastic.
And we did a tribal constitution session where they were thinking through, we had this governing resolution that doesn't accurately define how we make decisions. It doesn't connect to how we made decisions traditionally. Right. And how can we strengthen the way that we make these decisions, determine who our leaders are, in a way that's very Quapaw.
Yeah.
Quick question, what is Quapaw?
Oh, yeah.
Quapaw?
Right.
Do you want to talk about Quapaw?
Yeah, sure. They are, so they're a fairly small tribe and have always been a fairly small tribe they were in what's now Arkansas, now they're in northeastern Oklahoma. And they were one of the peoples I wrote about in my very first book. But then since that book, I've been able to sort of get to know their tribal historic preservation officer and other people in the tribe, and they've taught me a lot, I know. And then they sort of, you can tell their sort of 20th century history better than I can, but there are a number of reasons why they end up having a sort of, they're able to hold on to sort of sovereignty and governance, but in a way that maybe isn't today expressing, or isn't expressing, and also isn't expressing in the past, sort of Quapaw ways of governance.
And I just thought too, and because I had the pleasure of reading the chapter.
There is a chapter.
Yes, there's a chapter in the book. So the pleasure of reading the chapter in Quapaw, and it felt, so as he talked about this governing resolution, how it didn't fit with their understanding of how these decisions are made. They often referred to it or talked about their process as, we weren't under the Indian Reorganization Act, and I'm going to give you some federal Indian law policies and do a shameless plug. If you're interested in learning more about these policies, there's a federal Indian law class at UNC that you might be able to enroll for. So they constantly, said, we are not under the Indian Reorganization Act. We're not under the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act. That this is a document, doesn't work for us, but it was our strategy. And it reminded me about some of the strategy you talk about in Quapaw and how they were very particular in how they related to not only the Chickasaw and then the French that were attempting to develop a post there. Do you want to talk a little bit about at least your Quapaw?
Yeah, I would love to. They are, so the Quapaws are, so they live just west of the Mississippi in what's now Arkansas in much earlier than that, but in the late 1600s and 1700s when the French started coming. They were in the middle of sort of an ongoing war against the Chickasaws, and they were small and not powerful, and yet the French, when they came, they were able to the Quapaws were able to pull the French kind of into their sphere, get the French to provide them with I sort of struggle for what word to use. It's kind of like rent or tribute, or like the French show up, and basically these are giant. These empires send people out to the fringes to claim this giant space as French Louisiana, right? So this guy has to go a couple hundred miles up the Mississippi River with like 10 soldiers and to say to 8,000 Quapaws, this is French territory. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the Quapaws say, okay, if you want to say that, but you're going to give us, and they get, every year they get a big ceremony, big feast, lots of European goods that they can use, guns and blankets and needles and kettles and all kinds of things, in return for letting the French have a post there and continue to say on European maps that this is French Louisiana, which is so obviously not French. And then there's trade going on, but that's separate from this sort of at least yearly sort of payment for getting to be there. And then so the way the book works is that I have it goes forward chronologically in time, and I sort of introduce you to a certain people in a certain chapter. So this is in the 1700s, but then once I've introduced somebody, I keep coming back to them. So we meet the Quapaws again in the 20th century as they do similar things with the U.S. government when they are in a position of much less relative power to the United States, but sort of refuse the IRA, right? Refuse the New Deal, the Indian New Deal, kind of, And during allotment, at a time when the federal government was forcing tribes to divide up their lands and lose again a large percentage of their lands, the Quapaws, like actually many tribes, found ways of, the Quapaws went to the federal government and said, okay, we've already made a plan, and the math in the plan was totally to their advantage. It was not following the allotment law, but it's amazing to read the letters of it. This is Dawes, like the guy who wrote the Allotment Act. He writes back and he says, well, I don't know, they've already done it, so we might as well just take the plan they wrote down. And they end up with, still losing land, but with twice as much land as they would have had under the, if they kind of waited to be allotted. So I think that's one of many examples in here, sort of using, adapting, sort of using what they can, as the book goes on, in times of more and more trouble and unequal sort of negotiating power, or actually negotiating power that has completely shifted in the other direction, to still govern themselves as best they could until this time can come when maybe they can make it feel more Quapaw and increase their own sovereignty.
There was a line, I don't have it marked here with me, but I just chuckled when you talked about the Quapaw in the 17th century, where the French were trying to build or widen I just equate it to a street or a road, and they said, we can't get Quapaw to do it because they won't do it. And it just shows, it just shows the dynamic that's going on within that place.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. And they say the Quapaws are our best allies, but don't ask them to build it.
Yeah, they're not going to do that for you. That's your business. You do it. Yeah. Exactly. So they'll allow you to do it in their territory, but they're not going to do it for you. So nice little story there for you all as you're reading the book. So I talked a little bit about the nation building work that we do, and when we're thinking about this process of strengthening their governance systems, some of the things that we tell the tribal leaders, community members that we're working with, that there are three things that you should consider. You have to have clear rules, clear roles, and then clear goals. And I see this playing out in a few of the examples, if not all. With the Mohawk and the Great Law of Peace, there are clear rules, and the Great Law of Peace, that was their guiding, that was their goal, right? Yeah. They had roles with their clan mothers and others. I saw that in the Atham and Himdog, even in Cahokia and Huhukum. There were goals. That's right. Yeah. And when those goals, roles, and rules weren't clear, they pivoted. Yeah. So I wondered if you can talk about some of the nation building examples that you referenced.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought those up. The Mohawk Great Law, for example, it's a consensus-based democracy, and it has all these rules. Like one of them is so the representatives. There's a great council. The representatives to the great council, their skin should be 7 spans thick. Basically, don't let petty crap get you down. Just keep moving for the good. And they also say, the people don't be nagging your rerepresentatives about petty stuff. Help them stay what early Americans would have called virtuous, like thinking about the greater good of everybody. And the Great Law says it so many times and has so many different metaphors for this. It's like, we gotta say this over and over because this is not really human nature. Like, consensus is not human nature, right? Europeans come and they think Native tribes are so primitive because they don't, have a king and stuff. And it's these political systems are tremendously complicated and take a huge amount of rules. Right. Yeah. I thought maybe I one of the chapters is about the Cherokee nation building in the early 19th century. So I thought maybe I could read a little bit from that sort of speaks to this. Grace, you can see I have your bookmark. Let's see. Laminated for you. Just hold it a little. Oh, there. Cherokees determined to hold on to their remaining lands and sovereignty, not through war. This is a period where the Cherokees have had a devastating war against the United States. They're actually against Virginia, really. They've been And they've had the first land cessions, this is around the time of the American Revolution, where they've lost towns. Like before that, they'd had to given up some of their rights to certain hunting lands that they maybe shared with other peoples. But this is the first land cession where they've lost some towns, and people have actually had to move because of them. So this is at the beginning of the 19th century. Cherokees determined to hold on to their remaining lands and sovereignty, not through war, so not through war anymore, but by way of strong and consistent diplomacy, to insist on their right to continue as a neighboring nation to the United States. To do so, they would need to end the diffuse decision-making that had allowed U.S. officials and even individual land speculators to persuade a few Cherokee men to sign agreements to sell off the Cherokee Nation piece by piece. The most important function of the newly centralized national government, the Cherokee national government, would be to protect Cherokee land and sovereignty against their aggressive neighbor. Sometimes U.S.-focused histories assume these changes were motivated by a desire to imitate or impress the United States. In fact, early 19th century Cherokee political leaders wanted the Cherokee Nation to take its place among the nations of the world and have its sovereignty respected by other nations. Just as the fledgling United States claimed to be among the powers of the earth in its Declaration of Independence, the Cherokee Nation would assert itself as a global sovereign presence. Cherokees had killed each other in political disputes in the past, including over ceding land to the United States. But in 1809, they made structural changes that allowed them to speak largely with one voice for more than 2 decades. The immediate impetus came when a rumor circulated that Principal Chief Black Fox was considering trading Cherokee land for land west of the Mississippi River. Opponents deposed the Principal Chief. This new emergency easily could have led to more violence and death and perhaps to civil war. But the Cherokees were determined to stop the cycle of land cessions and retributions. In the fall of 1809, men and women gathered at the Cherokee town of Willstown and agreed to reinstate Black Fox's principal chief, but also appoint his opponents to important offices. The National Council wrote to declare their newly unified message to the United States. It has now been a long time that we have been much confused and divided in our opinions, but now we have settled our affairs to the satisfaction of both parties and become as one. You will now hear from us, not from the lower towns, nor the upper towns, but from the whole Cherokee Nation. They agreed to oppose all future land cessions, and they made changes to their governing structure, including written laws and a centralized national government. They hoped that instituting what Europeans and their descendants in the Americas saw as modern governance would give them the legal power and status as a sovereign nation to resist the United States. They also centralized governance to try to prevent groups of chiefs from acting on their own. These changes were part of a global pattern of redefining nationhood with written laws. Cherokees and many others, including the founders of the United States and contemporaneous nationalizing leaders in France and later Germany and Italy, hoped to create this kind of politically centralized sovereignty, recognized by people both within and outside the nation as binding a certain kind of people together. So Cherokees are sort of part of, one of the goals of the book is to sort of show Native history in global history over the centuries. And this is a period of, as I say, sort of creating written constitutions and certain kinds of nations that will move into the 19th century. And then, yeah.
No, I really appreciate that example because we often use Cherokee, at least the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, their written constitution, because we say that we constitute ourselves before, maybe it was orally.
Right.
But at least their written constitution, they have particular clause, like a clause within their, the one that they adopted more recently, that says every 10 years we're going to review it.
Oh, imagine.
Right. I mean, what would happen if the U.S. would say every 10 years, let's review to see, if this Constitution still meets the goals and objectives of us as a people. And, those are things, understandings of nationhood and sovereignty that the probably mainstream person doesn't know.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Right. Including that, and even people who know about the Cherokee Constitution will say the first Constitution. Well, no. Britain's Constitution was not written down. It is totally understandable that Native nations' constitutions were not written down, but that doesn't mean they didn't have laws. That doesn't mean they didn't have governing rules and structures. They absolutely did.
And we see those translate in different areas today. So, what do you hope people will walk away with after reading your book?
Well, I hope they'll see this history as long, continuing way back into the past, into the present, into the future. And I hope that, it's sort of to be the opposite of that. If you read one book about Native history, not that at all. Like that there's a further reading section that I hope people will go to. Some of it more academic, but some of it not. Some of it memoirs and things like that. I think a lot of different kinds of things are in that, and most of it written by Native authors. I think there's a lot to see there. And then also that, it's just it's never been a better time to learn Native history. It's everywhere. There are cultural centers, there are museums, there are exhibits going on right at the Ackland and at the North Carolina Museum of Art. Lots and lots of great things going on campus, most of which the American Indian Center is responsible for. And so, I hope it will, I think for both Native and non-Native readers, I hope it provides a sort of this kind of big picture understanding, but that there's a lot more to learn.
All right, well, thank you.
Very good.
Should we open up for a couple questions or?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
There are, you say 600 tribes, but really nations.
Right. Yeah.
Nations.
Yeah.
So, and each nation has their own way of doing things. Yeah. So, which is so wonderfully interesting. How can we? I mean, and we're going to read the book. We're reading the book. We're going to do that. But for instance, I know we go out to Washington State and the tribes out there get together, even though they have canoe trips and things like that, and really get together to do rituals. And I just wonder how we can learn about, if we want to learn about the Osage, for instance, how do we learn about what their practices are and what their principles are?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And it's just, as I said, it's never been easier because you can go to the Osage Nation's website right now and actually learn a huge amount. And it's, it's public facing, right? It's supposed to be understanding. You'll find things like about how to file for certain benefits that won't be it's a functioning government. So there'll be some things that aren't what you're looking for, but also tell you something about sovereignty, that tribal governments do a lot of the same kinds of things that county governments do, that local governments do, that state governments do. So you learn a lot just in that. But then in their history sections and their culture sections, there's almost always really fascinating stuff. And then, so for the Osage, for example, if you can get to Osage country, they have the oldest tribal museum in the country. It's amazing. And so, road trips to different places and cultural centers, they're like museums in that they are completely open to the public, and they're there to teach us about the history that they want us to know. And then they're a great place to do it. And then, of course, if you want to get a lot at once, the National Museum of the American Indian in DC or in New York, they're just terrific. And
we've been actually in there.
It's
wonderful.
That's good.
Thank you.
I'm fascinated by that teaser you had at the beginning about how there were a lot of urban areas, major urban areas, and then that dissipated. And I'm just wondering, I'm trying to think of other civilizations where that has happened, and I can't think of very many. And I'm also left wondering, would they have been in a better position or a very different position if they had retained urban areas as the U.S. was continuing to grow westward?
Yeah. So it is remarkable how so climate change. So the great cities, both in this part of North America, so north of central Mexico and Western Europe, they expand large-scale agriculture because of the medieval warm period. And when that ends, and sort of especially North America, sort of slides into the Little Ice Age, it's much harder to feed a ton of people on agriculture. And Western Europe sort of doubles down on hierarchy, monarchs remain, and North America, North and Central Mexico, which is very different, right, goes in a different direction and decides. It is much more traumatic and centuries long than decides gets it. That's not the right verb, but it generally Native North Americans develop smaller scale ways of living on the land and more, I think we could call more sustainable and more democratic ways of living.
Curious if any then, once that Little Ice Age was finished, did any urban areas grow out of that?
Yes. So not on the scale they had been before. Right. Until today. And of course, lots of Native Americans live in cities today. So back a century or two before. There are larger polities grow, and maybe in part to counter European colonization. So for example, the Creek Muskogees that I mentioned, they're a confederacy that forms out of multiple peoples that kind of and refugees that they take in, including entire refugee nations almost that become part of it. So there is a period in the 18th century of larger political units, especially in nations that are bordering the United States.
But not urban.
No. In fact, they really, if anything, spread out more. So the Shawnees, I talk about the Shawnees in the book. They when they move at one point and rebuild, and the Cherokees do this too. They purposely spread their farms out more, and I think at that point it's because Europeans burn towns, and so they if you're I don't have to really explain that anymore, do I?
No, we got you.
Yeah. Now the sort of more hypothetical question, I think we can look at central Mexico, and I don't think that being in an urban space did the Mexica or the Aztecs any favors, right? It was much easier, I think, for the Spanish to kind of take over, like knock off the top layer of the elite and plop themselves on top, which I apologize on it. That's a gross oversimplification of Mexican history. But and then disease hits much worse in cities, and so I don't know. I would think on balance, being a little more spread out, being able to make decisions without one, in a less centralized way, might have actually been an advantage.
Interesting. Kathleen, how important is culture and language in today? How important is it today in kind of affirming the kind of sovereignty and the history of Native peoples in this country?
I think it's the answer is different for different peoples. For some, it's tremendously important. There's really a renaissance going on these days, including in language and just new language programs, and trying to teach kids in their early years and trying to speak languages in tribal business. You go order a cup of coffee in Cherokee, you can now order it in Cherokee. But there are lots of peoples, especially who faced colonization early and rapidly, who don't have that connection to their historical language. They still have history that's been passed down. They have culture that has changed, but also been passed down. So I think it sort of depends. And then they're like all human cultures, they can make new traditions, right, and build new traditions out of old traditions. So I think sort of having a sort of not loose, but kind of generous definition of culture and a real human understanding. I think anthropologists today really rethought how they use even the word culture to recognize that it's always changing, it's always adapting. So I'd say culture is extremely important, but not in any sort of static way. I don't know, do you have anything you want to add to that, Danielle?
Yes, what Kathleen said.
Okay.
Kathleen, I'm curious. I understand that the demographic is not a monolith. We can't do it as such. But what might you think, given the resiliency of the demographic over centuries, how might we as a nation now, in the devices that we're currently living in, be informed and inspired by the resiliency of this demographic?
I think, I mean, just saying it, you're right, it is tremendously inspiring. And I think sort of one way to look at it, I don't know if this is inspiring or not, this might be bad, but to sort of, if you think about how long the history is in this place, the United States has really just been a blip. And, you know, just because it's lasted 250 years doesn't mean it's gonna last another 250 years. And if it lasts 500 years, that's pretty small, right? This book is a millennium, and it does not cover the history before the year 1000. So I don't know, as a human being in 2024, it's frightening to think, you know, of instability and change, but who knows what's coming? And I think, you know, the bets on Native nations still being here 250 years from now might be better than the United States being here in its, you know, current shape and form. I don't know, that's not inspiring at all. That's actually really, really frightening, because change is usually very difficult for the people living through it.
We have one back here and then up.
Yeah, so this is just occurred to me, but lately it seems like, maybe it's not even lately, but in the New Yorker or the New York Times, I keep reading about Native scholars who are then sort of, who are not Native scholars and turn out to not have any kind of Native background, but it seems like, I mean, for someone who comes from Asian history, this is like unimaginable, right? So I'm just really curious from you to know, like, what does that tell us about Native history, or what does that tell us about what people want to see or how they imagine their past? So I don't know any of that, but it's just a really curious phenomenon, because I see it all a lot, or, you know, even in politicians or whatever. And so I'm just curious to know what you think, you know, how any of those cases might coincide, or, you know, kind of mesh with what you've written about.
Yeah, non-Native Americans have a complicated relationship with indigeneity, right? And just, I mean, this love, hate, it's not hate, this love, like, I want to be you and I don't want to be you, sort of going back, you know, as long as Europeans have been here, like seeing, you know, romanticizing and seeing the best qualities that you could imagine in a human being or human society out of Native Americans, and at the same time assuming that European culture, European sort of the sort of progress of European civilizations to, you know, from primitive to means Native Americans are haven't done that yet, haven't progressed yet, sort of are behind, and then that sort of dual relationship of thinking about Native Americans, which has very little to do with actual Native people, has then different phases, right? And there are phases where, I mean, you should just only look at North Carolina. You know, there are phases where, you know, in the, there are places, you know, let's say times of Indian removal, like the last thing a white American is going to want to claim to be is Native, right? There are times where, I mean, the U.S. Census is down to, I think it's like, very, very small of people who get found by the census and identify themselves and are identified by the U.S. Census as Native. I think the bottom part is around 1900 or so. I don't know.
Or identified by the census taker.
Exactly, right. Right. So it is in no way a measure of how many people are members of Native communities at that period. Right. And then today, that number might, I don't know, be a little inflated by people who are like, yeah, I'm Native. I mean, if you fill out the U.S. Census today, you're supposed to write your tribe on there. You aren't just supposed to say you're Native American, but you know, it is an era where if there are ups and downs to this weird relationship to the idea of Native in the minds of non-Native Americans, we are in a period where it feels like more advantageous, I think, to misidentify. And then there's just this huge misunderstanding of sovereignty. Like, there are countless Americans who have Native ancestors, like many more than are actual Native Americans today. And I think that difference between having Native American ancestors and being a citizen of a tribe, Native nation today, which means that you are recognized by that nation as a member, as well as recognizing yourself as a member of that, as a citizen of that nation. Something that I kind of beat over and over in this book, and I hope it might help to, like, you grew up in Oklahoma. Yeah, you do, but you're not. If you don't know you're a Chickasaw citizen, you're not a Chickasaw citizen. You just are. You aren't. Yeah. I mean, it's a tiny bit more complicated than that, but it's not much more complicated than that. Yeah. I'm glad you let me take that question into more of a historical place instead of an actual today place, which is a scary place.
Yes, and enrollment, going back to those federal Indian law and policies, has been influenced in some of these outside understandings of who we are as Indigenous peoples. We've had this conversation often at the American Indian Center, sometimes when we don't want to have the conversation. But as Kathleen mentioned, we're not a monolith. As we understand who we are, it's very different. Sometimes it's through enrollment, sometimes it's through descendancy. But I view it as I know my community and my community knows me. That's what it means to be Lumbee, at least, because I'm Lumbee before I'm American Indian or Indigenous. And that might be different from other people. And there are other, policies, external forces that impacted how we can be engaged in our communities in some instances. Oh, yeah, right here, sorry.
That's okay. I was curious, you talked about the renaissance of the language, and I was also curious about historical documents that the tribes actually owned themselves that may have not been translated until more recently, and I was wondering if you'd had access to more recently translated tribal documents.
Yeah, the Cherokees do have quite a lot that are written in Cherokee, and a lot of which haven't been translated yet. So I only looked at the Cherokee Phoenix, which is the Cherokee's newspaper, and I looked at when it was the years that it was published in, when they were still in the East. So I forget it starts 1828, so the 1820s and 30s. And the Cherokee Phoenix is published in English and in Cherokee. And so scholars who only can read the English part, which I have sat around and learned a little Cherokee, but not enough to actually read a newspaper article. But scholars in the past who only read the English side thought they were the same, right? And so they would quote the English side, which is certainly there in the paper. But now that Cherokee linguists, Cherokee scholars who are scholars of language have gone and they've translated the Cherokee side, they say totally different things. Yeah, right. Yeah, right, which is not surprising, right? Exactly. Right. So, and I mean, it's a newspaper. It has two audiences. This is a newspaper that was distributed all over neighboring states and up to DC and everything, to and beyond to New England, to real white opponents of Indian removal, of whom there were many. And so the English language articles are mostly for them. I mean, there are English readers in the Cherokee Nation at that point, but even they mostly read. The literacy rate among the Cherokees in the 1830s of the Cherokee language, the Cherokee script, is over 90%. So Cherokees are reading the Cherokee, and they're reading it out loud to each other and sharing copies and things like that. And the Cherokee parts, I would say, if there's one, they're about lots of things, but if there's one main message of the parts that are in Cherokee in that newspaper, they are saying, we have to stay together. We are going to lose this if we aren't internally consistent, if we don't work as a group. And that is just the message over and over for years in that newspaper. And it's the same agenda on the English part and the Cherokee part, but the audience is so different, and then you understand some of the story if you only read the English, but getting to retranslate. So I read it in today's English translation by Cherokee linguists, but yeah, you learn a lot more about you learn what Cherokees are writing to each other. Yeah. But then there are lots more documents that I think scholars, graduate students who are working on these topics in the future will have access to a lot of documents that haven't been before.
Any question?
I was wondering how Esperanto might fit into this conversation.
Oh,
Hi. The language?
I haven't heard much about it.
No,
I haven't heard much about it.
that's around
It's supposed to be an international language.
Oh.
Is it easier to learn than
Yeah.
well, it's gotta be easier to
Chinese?
learn.
Yeah. I don't know that that's something that. Yeah. This is much more sort of reviving native languages, and usually the Cherokees are different in this, but for most of them using the Roman alphabet to do that.
I was thinking of how that would fit into the duality of centralization versus decentralization, which is, for me, both sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
You're 1 year too late, but Cherokee is now translated as part of Google Translate.
Oh.
Most other indigenous languages are not. They're having all sorts of problems translating that, but Cherokee, they've translated 50,000 words working with Cherokee translators.
Oh, that is fantastic.
So in case you want to go back now.
Yeah, right.
I know you're on to other things, but you know.
And actually Microsoft Word has the syllabary. You can toggle over to this, and so does like my phone. You can toggle over to the syllabary, and and I think several native languages are on Rosetta Stone now, right?
The name,
Yeah. There's never been a better time to study native languages. Of that particular.
So we have a question back here, and then we'll get you up front.
I've heard the claim made for minority populations in Southeast Asia and also Southeastern Europe that many of them, when confronted with centralized powers based on agriculture, that many of them, they consciously adopted a set of cultural practices in terms of the plants that they grew or the animals that they raised that would allow them to sort of escape the grasp of centralizing power and render themselves illegible to the state. And so I guess my question is that a useful lens for understanding like certain indigenous practices that we now see today?
Yeah, I think that's really good. So the period of decentralization that I was talking about in the book happens before Europeans get here, but I think that might be sort of useful for maybe sort of there's a history on the East Coast of peoples kind of going underground, right? Going to places lands that settlers aren't wanting for plantation agriculture, right? And being illegible. And sort of one of the things I talk about is how there's this sort of especially in the South, there's this push to push Native Americans into being just generic people of color. And so I think there's this kind of tension where you want to, they avoid removal. Like Indian removal is one of the few things that gets taught about Native American history. And yet there are, I don't know how many, but many Native communities across the East that avoid removal, in part, I think, by those kinds of strategies, by just sort of either making ties that are so strong to locals that they sort of get out of being removed, or kind of flying under the radar like that. But at the same time, not then sort of completely being erased into, like in the South, particularly, into being considered free people of color. So North Carolina has, under segregation in some places, and Virginia too, has Indian schools in addition to black schools and white schools, which I think is an effort by Native parents to assert, okay, we're not black, we're not white, we're not black, and if you're going to segregate, you need an Indian version. So I think that those things are sort of going on at the same time, sort of hiding but also both certainly internally, but even sometimes externally identifying as maybe not quite what you think we are.
Yeah, no.
You have lots more to say about that.
No. I completely agree. I often, and Melinda Maynor Lowry, who is a Lumbee historian, I often agree with her when she talks about these social institutions like churches and schools. It's specifically within the Lumbee community, I saw that as ways of asserting our sovereignty, as understanding these are our people, these are our students, and we're going to decide through what was known as blood committees and other forms of policing who would be able to attend those communities. And then, in addition to that, the teachers as well. They decided what teachers would come into those communities too. So,
And often had to pay them too, right?
Yes. Sorry, we had a.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps this would be for both of you. I had read one of your books. I just have to get the name here. It was The Native Ground, and I was so impressed with how many tribes there were. I mean, you just cannot keep track. And you were talking a little bit about the governance, and they're making their constitutions. So I was curious, with all of the tribes, were they pretty much similar in what their rules and regulations were? Or were there some who really were just so far out from the other tribes?
So I definitely overgeneralize. So my answers in the book will look like more similarity, more commonality than probably there has been in reality. So I don't know if you want to talk about more toward today.
Well, there's this whole federal Indian law and policy, like the Indian Reorganization Act, that impacted how our tribes have adopted these written forms of constitutions for many of them. Some of them are very contrary, conflict with their traditional ways of making decisions, identifying leaders, those types of things. And that's the work that I typically do, is thinking through what is written on paper, how do we govern today, and then what makes sense for us as a people today. Are there solutions within our culture or our traditions that we can incorporate that might not exist in those written forms of constitutions because of these external influences in how we govern? I hope that helps. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm curious what both of you think of the exhibit at the Ackland. Because it was different than I expected, I'll just say that. And I'm just curious what your take on it is and what your involvement might have been with it. Honestly.
There are a lot of different things in it, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Some things are different from others in it. Yeah. It's definitely worth seeing.
It is worth seeing.
Right.
And I think that there's a history behind Gilcrease and the collection that is worth talking about. Art is not my world. Political science, I can talk about government and constitutions all day, so this is what you're going to get from me. You know, I feel like as a Native person, and Kathleen, we were actually looking at the exhibit together for the first time. And I looked at her and I said, you know, I see the importance of having some of these pieces, but I also am conflicted of why our communities don't have those pieces. So there's a little bit of tension there. So that's my 2 cents. Please go see it.
Yes, right.
No, because we want to see it. We want to have those
Yeah.
Native voices and that Native representation on campus for sure.
Yeah. And I would say they have totally, the curators of the Ackland have totally talked with us the whole time. Right?
Yes.
They've been great, and there have been a ton of programs there that the American Indian Center has been part of and everything. I don't know if you've been to the one at the North Carolina Museum of Art. It's curated by a curator and scholar who's at UNC Pembroke, and it's I haven't been there yet.
I haven't either.
Okay, so I was about to say,
Sorry,
great.
Nancy. I think this
That's
is
not
recorded.
important. Yes, we'll get there, but.
Well, I was kind of curious what you were expecting. So you said it wasn't what you expected, but what were you expecting? Because that would be an interesting thing to hear you then.
I was surprised that it was organized thematically rather than historically.
Yeah.
And I was surprised that it was organized with all the nations kind of mushed together.
Yeah.
So there wasn't any clarity about any particular nation.
Yeah, I think that, oh wow, I'm definitely going to go beyond my expertise too, but I think that is an intentional way of showing Native art these days, of definitely getting away, and history too, getting away from a straight linear, which sometimes can feel like a narrative of decline, and instead mixing things up to show the sort of continuities. It also might be just the sort of number of things that they have. But I think that's why some of the rooms have things that are very different eras and coming from different places. And also I think a move away from a more anthropological view of now we're going to look at the plains, right? And now we're going to look at the eastern woodlands and maybe breaking away from anthropological categories and historical sort of periodizations that have more to do with kind of US and European timelines than they do with Native timelines. And maybe something will replace those and bring more order to it in the future. But I think we may be at a point where like the message really is more about mixing time periods.
And I was surprised how much of the art was by non-native artists also.
I can't believe it.
I don't know that.
Sure, that's true.
Yeah, a lot of the early drawings were from non-natives who came and, yeah.
There's a lot of native art there.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I don't
thank
remember
you.
the collection that well. One of the things that I do appreciate, at least with the themes, is that it starts within that sovereignty piece, right? It grounds you as Indigenous peoples. We are distinct. We have this political status that is inherent, not given to us by any outside government, and that grounds you as you're moving through that collection.
Good. We're talking ourselves back into it.
Yeah.
I like it. Right. Good.
Any other thoughts, questions? Wait, one more. Oh, and then, okay. We're a little past, but this will be the last one. Thank you.
Well, so in Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Baltimore, she at times she allowed herself to embarked on a flight of fancy about the possibility of becoming indigenous, and what that would entail or said welcome. I guess my question for you as a historian is to what extent has that been a decisive part of indigenous history in recent centuries of people immigrating or consciously, partially or wholly adopting or becoming a part of indigenous groups? Has it been more than just a distraction, or has that been a significant part of Native history development?
You mean sort of in the long history, not so much recently?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, like all sovereign societies, Native nations have made their own decisions about sort of immigration and citizenship. And before there was so much pressure from the United States, I think there's a lot. Native nations are completely able to adopt people, to take people who marry in and have their children be thoroughly part of that society. And sometimes it depends on lineality, if a clan passes through mothers or fathers, and which one the outsider is. But I think that has become more difficult for citizenship within Native nations since so much pressure from the United States. And so those things are quite fraught today, I think. But probably, I think used to be simpler, right? In a time when Native sovereignty was not contested. But I don't know, maybe not. Immigration is always contested, right? So maybe not.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kathleen.
So great.